Okay, yeah, hopefully you can all hear me now. So yes, at one of our, the Essex Historic Building Group AGMs a few years ago, our president at the time, David Martin, commented that our group has been very good at publishing accounts of individual medieval buildings, but that we could do more by way of synthesis. And so this talk was a response to that challenge. Just trying to change my slide. It's not doing anything. That was changed finally. So yes, this is a map of the Maldon district, coloured yellow, showing it in the context of the landscape regions of Essex. So the district combines the old Thirstable Hundred to the north of the Blackwater estuary and the Dengie Hundred to the south of the estuary. And that's basically the area that I cover as a local authority conservation officer. And I am reliably informed by my colleagues in the Planning Policy Department of Maldon District Council that there are currently over 30,000 houses in the Maldon district. Of these, 105 are known to predate the mid-16th century. 2 of these houses are brick. I'm not going to talk about them. The rest of the houses are timber framed. And in addition to that figure of 105 medieval houses, there are a further 21 houses which are potentially medieval, but whose true age is yet to be corroborated by an internal inspection. Because as you all know, with these buildings, you can't understand them without actually getting inside. And there are undoubtedly fragments of other medieval houses which are well hidden. I think I've personally discovered around 15 medieval houses while working in the district. So the actual number of medieval houses surviving in the Maldon district will be a little bit more than 105, but probably not much more because this area of Essex has been studied quite intensively. This map of the Maldon district shows the distribution of the 105 houses by parish. Unsurprisingly, the main concentration of the houses is in the town of Maldon. This is the district's principal town, and in 1500 it was one of only 3 towns in the whole of Essex which ranked as a borough, the others being Thaxted and Colchester. After Maldon, the parishes with the highest numbers of surviving medieval houses are Tollsbury and Bradwell-on-Sea, which flank the mouth of the Blackwater estuary. And then of the remaining parishes, the distribution map shows a slightly denser concentrations of surviving medieval houses to the north of the district in the old Thirstable Hundred than to the south of the district in the old Dengie Hundred. This map shows the numbers of taxpayers recorded in the lay subsidy returns of the 1520s. There are over 1,000 taxpayers in total at that time. And if we assume that each taxpayer is a householder, and there may be disagreement among historians over whether that is a completely reasonable assumption, but the number of medieval houses which survive today is around 1/10 of the number which existed in the 1520s. To some degree, the distribution of surviving houses across the district reflects the concentrations of taxpayers recorded in the 1520s, but the most striking anomalies are Burnham and Southminster in the southeast, because after Maldon, these appear to have been the most densely populated settlements in the district in 1524, but only 2 medieval houses are known to survive in Burnham and only 1 in Southminster. So quite why so few medieval houses survive in these parishes is a mystery. Only 4 houses in the Maldon district predate the late 14th century. And in the first part of this talk, I'm going to quickly show you each of these houses before providing an overview of the remaining majority, which date from the late 14th to the early 16th century. So the talk will focus primarily on variations of form and layout. Details of construction and decoration will be mentioned in passing, but will not be dealt with comprehensively. And we'll also touch upon the question of survivability and just how representative are the buildings which have survived to the present day. Between 2001 and 2005, Maldon Archaeology and History Group excavated a medieval house in the paddock to the west of Beeley Abbey, just outside Maldon. And it's a really valuable case study which reflects many of the aspects of the surviving buildings. And so it's a logical place to start an overview of the district's medieval houses. So the house faced west, so that's west is to the right of this slide, and it lies parallel with the lane which leads to Beeley Mill. So the lane is just behind that hedge and fence on the right. And medieval houses are normally orientated so that the long front elevation faces the road, although occasionally they chose to face a watercourse. To the north of the house, so at the bottom of the slide, the outline of several other structures was uncovered, one of which was interpreted as a smithy, meaning the house was plausibly occupied by the abbey's smith. The layout which was unearthed exemplifies the classic medieval three-cell plan, known as such, as you know, because it's of three distinct parts: a hall in the middle, a pair of service rooms at the low end, and a private withdrawing room or parlour at the high end. And in almost all the medieval houses which survive in the district, the hall is of 2 bays. The high-end bay is almost always slightly longer than the low-end bay. And the three-cell plan is a profoundly ordered and hierarchical one. And while this talk will illustrate considerable variations in the planned form of medieval houses in the district, all the examples are essentially based upon the hierarchical principles seen here at the Beeley Hall House. One of the excavated features which identifies the hall is a square platform of roof tiles bedded on edge into the floor, upon which an open log fire would have provided the only form of heating. The room would have been open to the rafters, and the smoke would either have been vented out of the building via some sort of hole in the roof, or it would have been allowed to seep through the roof covering. And we shall see a couple of examples of holes in the roof in the following case studies. 2 square pads of white Flemish bricks in the hall indicate that the structure was aisled. So those pads supported aisle posts. The house was probably built sometime between the late 13th century, when Flemish bricks started to be used, and the late 14th century, after which aisled halls become less common. Between the smithy and the house excavated at Beeley was a further structure interpreted as a kitchen. And we know from 16th century documents that at that date, and undoubtedly earlier, kitchens built as structures distinct from the main house were common. And elsewhere in Essex, several probable examples of detached kitchens have been identified and published. The Maldon district contains only one known extant example of a definite medieval kitchen, but it is the finest example in the county. The medieval kitchen at Little Braxted Hall has been dated by dendrochronology to between 1398 and 1410, and it was later converted to a dovecot, which accounted for its survival. It's since been converted to an office. The Hall House at Beeley was later adapted in several notable ways. A brick chimney stack was inserted into the hall in the low-end bay, backing onto the cross passage. Archaeomagnetic dating of the tile hearth showed that the open hearth was last fired between 1450 and 1505, indicating that the stack in the hall was inserted sometime in the late 15th or very early 16th century. framed chimney was added to the flank of the parlour, and the high end was extended or rebuilt to create a cross wing, or at least extended to create a larger cross wing. And a small wing was added projecting off the side of that cross wing. And these later alterations can be seen again and again in the medieval houses which still stand. And so I will refer back to the Beeley excavation a few times throughout the talk. So without further ado, let's look at the surviving houses which predate the late 14th century. And all four of these early houses are manor houses. The oldest dated house to survive in the Maldon district is Tollsbury Hall. This was tree ring dated in 2015 by Martin Bridge to between 1265 and 1272. So I think of it as circa 1270. And this evocative reconstruction drawing of the interior by Douglas Scott featured in John McCann's published account of the building. The manor belonged to Barking Abbey, and McCann suggested that it would have been built by the Abbey's own team of carpenters. The house comprised an aisled hall of 2 bays and the adjoining flank wall of a high-end cross wing. As we saw at Beeley, the high-end bay is longer than the low-end bay, and the cross wing is actually one of the earliest timber framed examples that we know of. It's just such a shame that so little of this one survives, because apart from the flank wall, the cross wing was reconstructed in the 15th century, probably because the floor level of the wing as first built was quite low. And the ground floor room to that cross wing may have functioned as a storage room akin to an undercroft. Originally, the building would have looked something like this. It had an inline low end, which has been demolished. And unfortunately, we don't know whether the cross wing was jettied or not. The carpentry is very similar to that found at the Cressing Wheat Barn, which is of the same date. There's a similar pattern of passing braces, but while the arcade posts in the Wheat Barn are plain, the arcade posts in Tollsbury Hall are octagonal in section with carved capitals. So this is a photograph showing one of the arcade posts at Tollsbury Hall. Everything you see around it is later. And just zooming in, that's a detail of the lovely carved capital. And then finally in this slide, I've coloured in yellow the timbers which actually survive. Like most houses of this date, it is quite a fragmentary survival. The aisles have been removed, as is normally the case, and the roof has been rebuilt, although there are a couple of reused smoke blackened rafters. At Bradwell Hall, the reverse is the case. So the 13th century roof survives, or part of it, but everything below has been rebuilt. The timbers in this roof are heavily encrusted with soot from the hearth that burned for centuries in the hall beneath it. This is a reconstruction drawing of the roof. The westernmost surviving roof truss, the left-hand end of the slide, has evidence for a hipped end. The hip rafters were attached to the top of a collar, leaving a large gablet. And then below the collar, there was wattle and daub infill, but above it, there was no infill. So the gablet was deliberately left open to vent smoke out of the building. So this is my first example of a hole in the roof. The rafters also have mortises for a projecting hood, which would have looked something like this. Later, in the 14th century, a collar purlin and a series of crown posts was inserted into the roof, presumably to reinforce the structure against longitudinal racking. The crown posts are very rough and have these jowled heads which clasp the purlin, which is a feature of some early crown posts. There is a much finer 14th century crown post roof at Boucher's Hall in Tollsbury. This has an octagonal shaft and a finely moulded capital. And this is another aisled hall, dated by Martin Bridge to between 1348 and 1378. So toward the end of the aisled hall tradition. The manor belonged to Robert Boucher, who was Lord Chancellor of England, no less, and who died in 1349. So the present hall might have been built at the end of his life, or it may have been built somewhat later. But it's a wonderful example of the decorated Gothic style. The straight square section passing braces encountered at Tollsbury Hall and Bradwell Hall here give way to elegantly curved braces, although the crown post braces notably are still straight. There is a foliate carved boss to the underside of the tie beam, sadly mutilated and largely concealed by plaster. And there's evidence for cornices applied to the arcade plates. The eastern aisle of the hall has been removed, but the western aisle survives. So from the outside, we get some sense of the hall's original form with this sweeping expanse of roof and low eaves. All that survives of the 14th century building is the open hall, of which this is my reconstruction drawing. The building continued in line at the high end to the right of the slide, and it was built open framed against an earlier wing at the low end. So it was in all likelihood a single crosswing house, like Tollsbury Hall, but with the crosswing at the low end rather than the high end. Again, the high end bay of the open hall was longer than the low end bay, and the cross passage was flanked by these two open trusses with reverse assembly construction, meaning that the tie beams go under the wall plates rather than over them. And when the Essex Historic Buildings Group visited this house, John Walker suggested that the choice of reverse assembly trusses might indicate the presence of front and rear porches, with the tie beams extending into the structure of the porches, which is a rather nice idea. But whether that was the case or not, the different construction would have emphasized the distinction of the cross passage from the rest of the hall. And this hall had a louver on the ridge of its roof. And the louver was situated in the high-end bay, adjacent to the central truss. And interestingly, that is the same position as the tile hearth in the excavated hall house at Beeley. Aisled halls fell out of use in the final quarter of the 14th century. And Heybridge Hall is an example of a large 14th century house which does not have aisles. So Heybridge Hall is the one on the right. It was 7.1 metres wide, which is somewhat wider than most of our unaisled halls, which are typically between 5 and 6 metres. And I think aisled halls must have had quite gloomy interiors, because the external walls were had relatively low eaves, which obviously limited the space for windows, unless you had dormers. But the omission of the aisles permitted a lot more wall space for large windows. And at Heybridge Hall, there were windows which reached right up to the underside of the wall plates. The arch braces to one of the tie beams at Heybridge Hall were cusped, which is a feature of other 14th century Essex houses. Tragically, Heybridge Hall was destroyed by arson in 1997, but thankfully it was recorded and the results were published by David Andrews. So I've based my drawing on the record drawings. So before the late 14th century, all we have in the Maldon district is a handful of high status houses. Each of them is a fragmentary survivor, presenting little clear evidence for the position nor the design of windows or external doorways. But after the late 14th century, medieval houses survive in much greater numbers across a wider social spectrum. And although no houses of this period escaped significant alteration, there are several examples which contain sufficient evidence to reconstruct on paper much of their original form and layout. And so our understanding of the design of these houses is therefore much clearer than that of the earliest houses. Surviving houses in the Maldon district which predate the mid-16th century fall into three broad categories, which are illustrated on this slide. So you have houses with inline ends, normally they were 1 story or 1.5 stories in height. So these are the smallest houses to survive. Houses where there is a cross wing at one or both ends. The cross wings were always 2 stories in height, but their halls were often quite a bit lower. And then fully floored 2-story houses, normally with a continuous front jetty. And these house types can all be seen on the well-known maps of Essex made by the Walkers of Hanningfield between 1586 and 1631, which have been recognised to depict the front elevations of houses with a degree of accuracy. And so if we consider the Walker maps for the whole of Essex and compare the numbers of the different house types illustrated on them with the numbers of the different house types which survive in the Maldon district, we can get some impression of the relative rates of survival. Of course, this has to be qualified by stressing that the Walker maps were made around half a century later than the period we are looking at. But I think many, if not most, of the houses depicted on the Walker maps are likely to predate the mid-16th century. Over half of the houses depicted on the Walker maps for Essex fall into the category of small inline houses, so 61.4%. But among the 100-odd houses which survive in the Maldon district today, we have just 12 examples where we know the building was completely in line. There are 5 examples where one inline end survives with no way of knowing the form of the other end, and there are 2 examples where all that survives is an end wall truss. So in total, there are between 12 and 19 inline hall houses surviving in the Maldon district. But the point is, it's a much smaller proportion survives today than probably once existed. 26% of the houses depicted on the Walker maps had 1 or 2 cross wings. So they were in the minority at the time. By contrast, 72 of our 100-odd surviving medieval houses have 1 or 2 cross wings. And in 44 of these houses, all that survives from the medieval period is a crosswing. 32 houses in the district retain all or part of an open hall, but only 12 of these include a reasonably intact hall roof. And so the key factor influencing the survival rate of these houses seems to be height. Crosswings, which are always a full 2 stories in height, have a much higher rate of survival than inline ends and open halls, which are usually equivalent to 1 story or 1.5 stories. Structures that were a full 2 stories could be more easily adapted to first floor living in the post-medieval period. And then finally, we have 11 examples of fully 2-storied houses which appear to date from the first half of the 16th century or slightly earlier. Most are houses with continuous front jetties. You've got almost 7% illustrated on the Walker maps, but then many of those may have been built in the second half of the 16th century when 2-story houses became a lot more common. Anyway, that's enough looking at numbers. Let's look at these different categories of houses in a bit more detail. This map shows the distribution of medieval houses with inline ends which survive in the district. And for reasons that are not wholly clear, all of the examples are in the northern and western parts of the district. None have yet been found to survive on the Dengie Peninsula. The Hall in Little Baddow is the most complete inline hall house so far discovered in Essex. It's actually situated just outside the Maldon district, within the boundary of the Chelmsford city area. But because our understanding of Waterhall's original design is so complete, it serves as a useful benchmark against which to assess the generally more fragmentary survivals in the Maldon district. All of the original doorways survive. You have opposed front and rear doors and the typical position, creating a cross entry at the low end of the hall. And then the doors to the service rooms are placed in the middle of the low end wall of the hall. And then the door to the parlour was placed at one end of the high end wall of the hall, in order to avoid the bench which was fixed to the centre of the high end wall. And the bench is evidenced by a low row of peg holes, a couple of which are shown in this drawing, and by mortises for a draft screen to one side of the bench. And the pattern of doorways shown here pervades the medieval houses which survive in the district. The windows are all unglazed with diamond section mullions and served by internal shutters. And you have large front and rear windows occupying the high-end bay of the hall, illuminating the high-end bench like a stage set. And in all these ways, Waterhall is typical, although it does have one unusual aspect in that the high-end, excuse me, in that the high-end room was open to the rafters. There is evidence for soot blackening in the roof, so it obviously had its own half, and it may be that this room functioned as a kitchen rather than a parlour. Waterhall is effectively 1.5 stories in height, and 9 times out of 10, inline hall houses are no taller than this. 6 instances have so far been found of single-story hall houses, by which I mean if there is an upper story, it is almost entirely in the roof space, with the floor structure level with the eaves. So this slide compares the scale of one end of Waterhall on the left, which is 1.5 stories, with Little London House in Wood and Walter, which is just 1 story in height. Unsurprisingly, none of these single-story houses retain their original roof structure. So all have been replaced to provide more space at first floor level. And the next slide kind of illustrates why. So this is a photograph of the upstairs room in Little London House, and it shows you how the external walls and roof have been heightened. Because originally it would have only been possible to stand up straight in the middle of this first floor room. For this reason, the survival of the smallest medieval houses is rarely evident from the outside. This is a photograph of Little London House, and then I've just sort of sketched over it the form of the original building. It's really quite tiny. Its eaves were just 2 meters tall, and its span was only 4 meters. It's about just over 10 meters long. Wood and Mortimer Hall is the tallest example of a district of an inline hall house, being almost 2 stories in height. Its walls are twice as tall as Little London House. This photograph shows Wood and Mortimer Hall from the outside, and it's been relegated to the role of a service range when a large brick house with Dutch gables was built in front of it in the 17th century. But this is an isometric reconstruction which shows how proportionally it's quite a bit taller than our other inline houses. And indeed, this one was a manor house, so that's perhaps unsurprising. Although it's unusual for a manor house to be built with inline ends and not crosswings. This is Draper's Farm in Haybridge. It consists of a hall and an inline end. So the medieval part is the low roofed part. The high end accommodation has been replaced. That's where the full two-story part is on the photograph. So the span of this building is 6 meters. So it's half a meter wider than Water Hall, and yet its eaves are slightly lower. And instead of having 2 rooms at the service end, as is the paradigm represented at Water Hall, it actually has, it's actually slightly more common for inline service ends to have just a single service room. And in this house, the single service room is accessed by an off-centre doorway with an arched head. That's shown in this photograph. At Ravens in Langford, the single inline service room, which has been demolished, was accessed by a centrally placed door with a square head. And then back at Little London House in Wood and Walter, which again is the smallest hall house so far discovered in the district, all one finds is a very narrow service room, accessed by a doorway positioned in this instance against the front wall. So this is the only instance I've encountered in which the service door is not placed near the centre of the hall service partition. The Bell in Purley is a lovely pub if you haven't been, but if you do go, it incorporates the fragmentary remains of the inline service end of a medieval house at the left-hand end here. But all that survives, or at least remains visible, of the medieval phase of this building are the first floor joists of the service end, which goes to show how fragmentary the survivals of these houses can be. But evidently it had an undershot passage with spear screens between it and the body of the hall. Thankfully, there are houses which are more complete. At Orchard Cottage in Langford, which is very similar in size to Water Hall, all 3 cells survive, but the front wall and the roof has been replaced. And it's another example of a house with a single service room. I often find that the difference in status between the high-end and low-end rooms is emphasised by the quality or treatment of the timbers. At Orchard Cottage, the high-end room on the right has chamfered ceiling joists, whereas the service room has unchamfered floor joists. And then moving back down the social level to the much smaller Little London House, the parlour floor joists are not chamfered, but they're good quality and straight-edged, whereas the service floor joists are very rough and waney-edged. The high end of inline hall houses normally contains just 1 room, although occasionally there are 2, as at Jacob's Farm in Heybridge. So here, the front room has chamfered ceiling joists and was perhaps the parlour or bedroom, whereas the rear room, which contained the stairs leading up to the first floor chamber, has plain joists. And may have had a more utilitarian function. And as we'll see in discussion of cross wings, the rooms which contain the stairs in this period are often evidently of lower status. Fortunately, this is one building that I have not been able to get inside, hence the lack of detail in the drawing. And what I know about it is thanks to David Stenning, who wrote the list description and made some sketches of it. But the owners did let me survey the outside of the high-end gable end wall, which has exposed timber framing. This has what's known as an interrupted tie-beam construction. So you see one length of tie-beam here, interrupted by this full-height post, and same thing on the other side. And that's a feature which is common to inline hall houses, and it indicates the use of a half-hipped roof. So if the roof had been replaced, but you saw this pattern of framing in the gable, you'd know that it had a half hip. And that half-hipped roofs and interrupted gable end tie beams is a feature common to inline hall houses. An interesting variant is found at Brook Farm in Wood and Mortimer, where the half-hipped gable end omits the tie beam altogether. And this is another pretty small house. It's just over 1 story in height with a span of 4.6 meters. It is also the only medieval house I've so far discovered for which there is evidence that part of the timber frame was originally concealed by external plaster. So the common studs are set back slightly from the outer face of the wall plate and the principal posts. I understand that evidence for early rendering like this is quite common in Suffolk and Norfolk, I believe, but this is, as far as I'm aware, the only example so far observed in a medieval building in Essex. More high status alternative to the inline end is to have a 2-story crosswing with a roof orientated at right angles to the main house. As I've already said, although houses with crosswings were in the minority during the medieval period, they survive in much greater numbers than houses without crosswings, presumably because they're full 2 stories in height and therefore much more easily adapted to post-medieval first-floor living. 72 of the 105 medieval houses surviving the district were ones with a crosswing, but in 44 of those examples, all that survives predating the mid-16th century is just a single isolated crosswing, so making it impossible to determine the complete form of the original house. Crosswings occurred at either one end of a house or at both ends. There are 12 definite examples of double crosswing houses in the district, of which only 3 retain their open hall. There are 9 definite examples of single crosswing houses. And in 6 of these single crosswing houses, the crosswing is at the high end, and in 3, the crosswing is at the low end. So among single crosswing houses, there is a general preference for high-end crosswings, but not an exclusive one. So the left-hand example is Jacob's Farm in Heybridge again, where the crosswing is at the low end. Crosswings were normally jettied to the front with a flat elevation to the rear. There are, however, several examples of 2-bay crosswings where both the front and the rear elevations were jetty. So this is my reconstruction drawing of Gun Farmhouse in Wickham Bishops, illustrating it from the rear, showing its crosswing was jetty to the front and the back. Crosswings are normally gabled to the front and hipped to the rear, as in the case at Gun Farmhouse, but there are also examples where the rear is gabled too. At Brook Farm in Latchington, both the front and the rear of its low-end crosswing has a hipped roof, but this is the only example so far discovered in the Maldon district. So the only alteration to this roof as we see it today is that it originally had little gablets which have been chopped off. Now, among the 72 surviving crosswings, there is a real considerable degree of variety. And one way of breaking them down is by the number of bays. Around 2/3 of our surviving crosswings are of 2 bays, and then around 1/3 are of 3 bays. I can think of no logical reason why 2-bay crosswings should have survived better than those with 3 bays, so the ratio may reflect that of those actually built. So let's consider those 2 types in turn. The room layout of 2-bay crosswings observes essentially the same variations as inline ends. On the ground floor, the plan may actually be in line with the front and rear walls, as at Gun Farmhouse, or quite often the rear may project back beyond the rear wall of the hall. In almost all the examples studied, there is a single 2-bay room on the first floor of the crosswing. On the ground floor of low-end 2-bay crosswings, there are almost always 2 rooms. However, there are always exceptions, and the crosswing at Brook Hall, again, has a pair of service doors leading to a single room. There is just a short 3-stud partition between the two doorways, the purpose of which was to have something to open the doors against. And this is not an isolated phenomenon, and we'll consider it further later on. The cross passage is sometimes undershot, for example, at St Lawrence Hall, undershot meaning that it's contained within the body of the cross wing rather than the body of the hall. This wing has evidence for unusual arch-headed windows, which are shown in this reconstruction drawing. And surprisingly, it was missed for listing, despite the fact that you can see the medieval framing quite clearly showing through the render there. I did apply to have it listed and it was turned down. On the ground floor of high-end two-bay cross wings, there is typically just one room, but there are very often two. For example, at 117 High Street, Maldon, where the front room appears to have been a shop. This is one of 5 examples of medieval shops in the district. They are all in Maldon town, and they can occur in the high end or the low end. So here, the rooms in the high-end cross wing have separate doorways to the hall. But back at Gun Farmhouse, there is a single doorway with the 2 ground floor rooms connected by an internal door between them. So around a third of our cross wings have 3 bays. And these 3 bay cross wings are almost all high-end cross wings, and most are found in urban areas. And that additional bay permits a greater degree of variation and complexity among the surviving examples. All Saints Vicarage in Maldon has 2 3-bay cross wings, including the only low-end example in the district. The hall in the middle was rebuilt circa 1600. And these wings are really high status, both having oriel windows originally and flank wall chimney stacks. And it's likely that one or both of these cross wings were part of the house which Robert Darcy ordained to be built upon his death in 1448. The house was to accommodate 2 chaplains who would say mass daily in a chantry chapel that was to be added to All Saints Church. So this appears to be a purpose-built priest house. The western cross wing, the one on the left, famously incorporates wall paintings in the front ground floor room depicting the sacred IHC monogram and the three-leafed clovers, thought to symbolise the Holy Trinity to which the altar in Darcy's chantry was dedicated. So as I say, both cross wings have 3 structural bays, but in the western high-end wing, the rear bay is very narrow. And there are typically 2 alternative explanations for a narrow rear bay like this. Sometimes this narrow bay might be a smoke bay, but that clearly wasn't the case here. Alternatively, it might have been to accommodate a flight of stairs. The joists I've drawn in this bay are of the same size as those in the front 2 bays, but it's not at present possible to determine whether they are original or later. They're simply lodged into place. We can't see whether they're mortised. And as you can see, this building was very thoroughly restored early in the 20th century. And it's possible that the existing joists in that rear bay were inserted then to replace skinny joists that might have been used to close a stair trap in the post-medieval period. There are a couple of pegs to this post, which seem to relate to a door head, suggesting there was most likely a door which led to the base of a flight of stairs. But on the rear wall of that cross wing, there is an original first floor doorway, which may have led to a flight of stairs, but I think it's more likely, given its rather narrow size and crude head, that it relates to a garderobe at the head of an internal flight of stairs. The low-end cross wing to the right of this slide is also very interesting. Surprisingly, it had a doorway in the front elevation leading directly to a flight of stairs that led up to a chamber in the front bay at first floor level. Also, the presence of a chimney on the flank of the middle bay may indicate that this is an early example of an integrated kitchen. There is now a very fine stone fireplace in this position, which appears not to be the original one. Of the original fireplace, all that survives is a sawn-off Bessemer fixed into this post and pegged. So was this the Bessemer of a timber-framed chimney stack? Because with masonry stacks, you don't tend to fix the fireplace Bessemer into the timber frame. We'll see another example of this in a moment. As we saw with the inline ends, the quality of the ceiling joists in the crosswings or their degree of elaboration may reflect the relative status of ground floor rooms and hint at their intended functions. So in the two-blay front ground floor room of the crosswing at Noakes Cross, Great Braxted, the principal floor joist was moulded and the common joists chamfered, whereas the joists in the rear one-bay ground floor room, which contain the stairs, are plain. And similarly at 5 Head Street, Goldhanger, the arrangement of rooms has been switched round. So the one-bay room containing the stairs and the plain joists is at the front, and the two-bay room with the fancy moulded joists is at the rear. And in the 3-bay crosswings, we also witness a considerable variety in terms of the position of stairs. So at 5 Head Street, Goldhanger, the stairs were in the front bay, which is the least common position. At 144 High Street, Maldon, the stairs occupied a central bay and accessed directly from the hall or from the rear ground floor room. And this is a recent cutaway isometric reconstruction showing how the stairs rose up the middle of the wing. There was a single 3-bay chamber at first floor level, and the stairs were sort of smack bang right in the middle of that room in a rather seemingly awkward position. At the Rose and Crown in Maldon High Street, the stairs are in the rear bay. I'm sorry about the quality of the reconstruction drawing in this instance. And then at Heybridge Hall, the crosswing contained a 2-bay front room and a single-bay rear room on both stories, and both were served by their own stair trap, so presumably to enhance the level of privacy for the users of these rooms in what was quite a substantial manor house. Then in the high-end crosswing at the King's Head, Bradwell-on-Sea, there is no gap in the original first floor structure for an internal stairs, but there is evidence for a ground floor doorway in the rear wall of the hall, which probably led to an external staircase that rose against the rear wall of the crosswing. A similar arrangement has been observed at other Essex medieval buildings. The King's Head suffered a damaging fire in 2014, but its subsequent restoration revealed several further notable features. Its original hall doesn't survive, but the position of the hall wall plates was revealed by redundant mortises in the northern flank of the crosswing. Unusually, the hall adjoined the rear 2 bays of the crosswing, meaning that the wing's front bay sat forward of the hall. And this arrangement is unique in the Maldon district, but there are other examples in Essex and Suffolk. The arrangement here might be explained by the strong possibility that the building faced the parish marketplace. The setback hall plausibly reflecting the need to preserve space for the market. The crosswing had a front ground floor room of 1 bay, possibly a shop, or was it an ale room? There's a possibility this building was an inn from the outset. The design of the front ground floor wall unfortunately can't be determined, but on its northern flank elevation, you had a window and a door providing direct access from the street. At first floor level, there was this grand 3-bay chamber, and several aspects of the chamber's design articulated a hierarchical sort of spatial progression from relatively dark and confined at the rear where it's thought the entrance was located, to brightly lit and open at the front. One particularly noteworthy feature of this crosswing is that all three external walls of the chamber's front bay were lined by a continuous bench, which the owner has reinstated. So the evidence for the bench was a row of low peg holes to every other stud and notches cut into the internal corners of the corner posts. In reinstating the bench, they reused these holes and notches, and we had some debate around precisely how the bench would have been fixed. And interestingly, the most practical solution the carpenters came up with was to use these sort of knee braces with a projecting leg that went through the hole. So a fascinating exercise in experimental archaeology. While the presence of a bench in the chamber of a crosswing is unusual, there is evidence for comparable benches in the next two buildings I'm going to show you. And just before I move on from the King's Head, I'll just quickly show you a couple of before and after photographs of the restoration, because it's very impressive. It was a really devastating fire. You can see the damage it's caused here. The only positive of it was that it exposed a medieval building we had no idea previously existed. And that's the standard to which it's been restored, being admired here by the Essex Conservation Officers Forum, but all restored in accordance with, strictly in accordance with the evidence, the archaeological evidence. That's what it looked like shortly after the fire, and that's what it looks like more recently. The timbers have all silvered down now. As I said earlier, around 2/3 of our crosswings have 2 bays, and 1/3 has 3 bays. But there is one example of a crosswing with 4 bays, and that is the low-end wing at the Swan in Maldon High Street. So this building was studied by David Stenning when it was refurbished in the early 1990s, and then I took a look at it while it was refurbished again a few years ago. This reconstruction drawing includes some areas of structure which Stenning recorded in the 1990s that were no longer visible by the time I looked at it. And the Swan is one of only 3 examples of double crosswing houses in the Maldon district, of which the open hall and both crosswings survive and are all of the same date. Because as you probably know, crosswings were often added later, and open halls have a relatively low survival rate. The Swan's open hall is taller than usual and taller enough to allow the insertion of a first floor and maintain a decent amount of space in the upper chamber, although the central tie beam was removed. And the Swan is one of the most substantial and magnificent medieval houses in Maldon. It really deserves more detailed description than I've got time for tonight. But like St Lawrence Hall, the low-end crosswing incorporated an undershot cross passage. There is evidence that the front entrance may have been given visual emphasis by some form of canopy formed by the extension of the floor joist directly above it. Very much like the ancient house Thetford, to use a Norfolk example. The front ground floor room of the low-end crosswing occupied 2 bays, and yet, intriguingly, was, like we saw at Brook Hall, accessed from the cross passage by a pair of service-style doorways. There is absolutely no evidence for a partition between these 2 bays. So no mortises in the binding joist, no notches for wattle and daub infill to the posts. And also at either end of the principal joist, it's supported by knee braces, which I unfortunately can't really see in this photograph, but they're the sort of thing you don't tend to find as part of a partition wall. And the use of a pair of service-style doorways to access a single room is a phenomenon encountered in a few other low-end crosswings in Essex. And actually, I recently saw an example in Debenham in Suffolk. I wonder whether you get it in Norfolk too. The intention may have been to make use of some form of movable screen, but my theory is that by this date, the architectural motif of paired service doorways at the low end of an open hall had acquired a degree of symbolic value, to the extent that within houses of a certain status, they were sometimes used when they weren't really needed. What we do know is that that front room had a commercial use, since there is evidence for a shop front consisting of a large arched opening with a low sill and then a doorway providing direct access from the street. It's also notable, I think, that the low-end crosswing at the Swan is somewhat wider than the high-end crosswing. And for this reason, it is in the Swan's low-end wing that we find the best chamber, what we might term the solar, which occupies the front two bays on first floor. It's the only first floor chamber in the building which has the distinction of a crown post with four-way braces, indicating its superiority over the other rooms. I could say a lot more about this building, but as we're short of time, I will move on. Now, while the desire for more space in your crosswing was commonly accommodated by further bays, there are also cases where projecting wings were added to the flank of the crosswings. So the excavated house at Beeley had a small projection off the flank of its high-end crosswing. There is a projection off the flank of the high-end crosswing at Detached in Cold Norton, shown here on the right, the proportions of which seem quite similar to the example excavated at Beeley. However, this is actually a late 16th century example, so strictly outside our period. And then there's another somewhat smaller example at Noakes Cross in Great Braxted. Again, it's a post-medieval addition, but quite what function these projecting side wings had is uncertain. But the ultimate example of additional accommodation attached to the external flank of a high-end crosswing is Stowe's farmhouse in Tillingham, tree-ring dated between 1478 and 80. In this instance, all of one phase. Here, the flank wall projections exceed the scale of the wing itself. It used to be thought that that what survives at Stowe's farm was a self-contained house, but as I've looked at more medieval houses, it seems clear to me that what remains is the accommodation found beyond the high end of an open hall that has long disappeared. And I've just sort of highlighted in grey where that open hall was. There's a mortise to this doorpost, which I had originally interpreted as a draft screen within the wing itself, but it seems more likely that it was for a draft screen to one side of a fixed bench against the high end of a hall. The rear wall of the hall was probably here, with an external door in the same position as that we saw at the King's Head, leading to an external stair up to this first floor doorway up here. The principal chamber in this wing, again, had a bench with a draft screen to one side, and it was heated by a chimney stack, which was replaced in the 17th century by a brick stack, but the evidence for the original fireplaces is very similar to that we saw at All Saints Vicarage, with the sawn-off end of the Bessemer trenched and pegged into a stud. Again, presumably indicating the stack was timber framed. Much more could be said about Stowe's. It's got a wonderful, complex layout, and amazing king post roofs, two-story garderobe, but there isn't really time to do it tonight to do it justice. From the late 15th century, houses in Essex begin to be built with floored halls. A rural Essex example, Hole Farm at Stansted, was recently dendrodated to 1492. Numbers 106 to 110 High Street, Maldon, shown here, is an example which probably dates from early in the 16th century, but it could be earlier. It still has unglazed mullioned windows and a crown post roof. And it's very interesting to note that in Norfolk, you have a house with a floored hall dated to the 1420s at 9 Town Green, Wyndham, which goes to show that in urban areas, floored halls can occur earlier than expected. Like most of our examples of two-storey houses, this one has a continuous front jetty, and the layout is essentially the same as earlier open hall houses. It's got a 3-cell plan with a low-end hall, high-end, bench with draft screens against the high-end wall. But in this instance, there are shops at either end in the front rooms. There's an original framed opening in the floor structure for a chimney stack that would have backed onto the cross passage and heated the hall. So that tends to be the first position of hall chimneys in this part of Essex, as we saw at the excavated Beeley Hall house. Tolleson Darcy Hall is a house built early in the 16th century with a floored hall, heated in this instance by a chimney stack on the rear wall, that chimney stack there. And this is a high status manor house on a moated site, accessed by a 16th century bridge and served by a 16th century dovecot. The evidence of maps and an early drawing show that this house once had a U-shaped plan, which is an example of how additional accommodation was provided to houses further up the social ladder. But at its core, the building still has the 3-cell plan. And just like much more modest houses, such as Water Hall, it has a pair of service doors, although in this instance, the doors are embellished by very lavish carved decoration, which are quite difficult to photograph because of this later staircase. Hence, I've used a photograph from the Royal Commission of Historic Monuments. And at this date, in this status of house, it's not surprising to find that the windows are all glazed and there were several oriels. So we've seen some ways in which larger houses burst beyond the core of the 3-cell plan, but we must not forget that there are a minority of houses among those which survive, which are of only 2 cells. And these are sometimes called single-ended houses because the ancillary rooms only occur beyond one end of the open hall. And one of the really interesting questions, I think, is what factors influence the decision to build a house with just a high end or just a low end. All the surviving medieval examples in the Maldon district are part of urban or nucleated settlements. And as with the rest of the Essex, no particularly clear rural examples have yet been discovered. I wonder whether you have yet found many 2-cell medieval houses in Norfolk, particularly in rural areas. The different types of 2-cell houses found in the district reflect the different types of 3-cell houses. So we get examples with inline ends, with cross wings, and ones that are fully floored. On the edge of Maldon, you've got 13 and 15 London Road, which represent the remains of a row of at least 3 2-cell houses, each comprising a hall with a high-end room. These are among the smallest houses to survive from the medieval period. And this photograph is taken in what was the open hall of number 13, looking at the high-end wall with this lovely pair of braces. And just like much higher status buildings, it had a fixed bench, evidenced by a low row of peg holes and mortises for a draft screen. 160 to 168 High Street Maldon represent a row of 3 2-cell houses. So you've got a low-end crosswing here with a rebuilt hall, and then a pair of half Wealdons consisting of halls and low ends. And this is my isometric of the Wealdons. The left-hand example had an undershot cross passage and evidence for a shop in its front room. And then finally, numbers 9 and 11 High Street, Bradwell-on-Sea, just next to the King's Head. They don't look very interesting from the outside, but they were, in fact, built in the first half of the 16th century as a pair of two-cell long jettied houses. On the ground floor of both houses, you had a hall and a low-end room. And these are, I think, fitting buildings to conclude this talk with, because they are the first medieval buildings that I did a measured survey of back in 2011. So this talk has provided a very rapid overview of the medieval houses which survive in the Maldon district. The 100-odd houses which survive are a small fraction of the numbers which once existed. We've seen how certain types of houses and parts of houses have survived better than others. Typically, taller houses or parts of houses have survived better than lower structures. We've witnessed a considerable variety of form and layout, and yet all houses are based upon the hierarchical principles we first saw at the Hall House excavated at Beeley Abbey. Even the houses which are two-cell are based upon the principles of the three-cell house. I'd be very interested to hear how what I've told you tonight compares with medieval houses in Norfolk. Finally, if this talk has whetted your appetite for medieval timber frame buildings, you might be interested in attending this talk, which I'm currently preparing for the Hertfordshire and Essex Architectural Research Society. It's going to be a virtual walk down Maldon High Street with lots of reconstruction drawings illustrating what survives behind the town's 18th and 19th century facades. But yeah, thanks for listening. Share.